Part two. I actually, it's funny. I actually feel a lot better now. I mentioned in my last video that I was feeling some resistance to doing it at all. And then it took me forever to try and like get it uploaded. I was really struggling with that, and I just felt so like anxious isn't the right word, but just I wanted it done. I wanted it up. I got it out of my mind. I wanted it out into the world. So now that it is, I feel a lot better. And I feel a lot less nervous about going on with the rest of my story. So if you haven't listened to that one, listen to that. Again, mentioning the blog. Um, I noticed because I like rewatched myself today because I wanted to make sure I don't kind of repeat myself, even though I have my little guide here of my talking points with me. But I rewatched that and I reread the blog just to see kind of, I don't know, just to freshen it up in my mind. And it is amazing the difference, when we publicly put out that blog, it was huge. It was huge for us. Um, and I felt like I had come to a place that I was so healed and so strong. And now reading that, I'm like, wow, I've come leaps and bounds since then, too. I'm in like a much different place mentally, emotionally, all that stuff. Um, so yeah, it's interesting to reflect. And like I said, I feel a lot less nerves about the whole situation now. So that's good. So I feel like this is going to happen to me that I'm going to get it all out and then I'm going to be like, oh, I should have mentioned that. I forgot that because like I said, we're talking about a lifetime of stuff. So there was one thing I wanted to mention that I kind of left out that is a little bit sensitive. Some people are going to get, sensitive to this, but I also wanted to mention, I think what I would classify as a little bit of like religious trauma as well, because um, I was raised in the Catholic Church and I remember, sitting there and I mentioned all these feelings of guilt and shame as like a theme of my childhood and young adult life. And I think even though like I had it from all these different sources. I had it coming from my parents, but also sitting in church. We went to church a lot, and I feel like sitting there as a little kid who this horrible stuff is happening to, and just having it like drilled into me and us that like we are sinners and like we do bad things because we're basically bad at our core, and the only salvation is if you live this perfect life, and if you stray from, of course your sins are forgiven, but you have to like repent for them. And it just, to me, confirmed all the things that like I deserve this, or I'm bad and this is why it's happening. I'm a sinner. Um, and like bad, people just do bad things because we're all sinners. And I feel like the lying that I did about like being sick, about whether, wanting my bone to be broken for whatever reason, all that stuff, being told repeatedly over and over that you're a sinner and you're bad, and if you lie it's a sin, and this and that, like it just all led to even more shame for me. I did not find solace in the church. I have always had like a personal connection with God and Jesus and stuff like that. For me now as an adult, with all this baggage that I'm carrying, organized religion at this point in my life is not for me. I'm not about it. But that doesn't mean I don't have a personal connection with Jesus and with God. It's just I do relate a little bit to people when they're talking about religious trauma. I have a definite resistance to anything that kind of, even in yoga. Yoga is a spiritual practice that happily walks alongside with whatever religion you are. But anything in yoga that like resembles like prayer and stuff like that, and even sometimes just the terminology has I kind of, it carries a weight for me that I'm kind of put off by. It's something that I didn't realize how angry I was about this particular thing until Easter this this past year. It just kind of bubbled up in me, and with raising my kids and how I don't want them to experience feeling like at your core you're bad. Because that part I disagree with. I don't think at our core we are bad. So that's a side note from another thing that I feel like contributed to those feelings of like shame and therefore silence for so long in my life. And it is relevant to my life now just because I have this kind of like, my guard is definitely up around organized religion. I will just say that. And that's not to say I'm not judging people if they are very into their religion or anything like that, but for me at this point it's not happening for me. And maybe that'll change. Maybe I'll kind of grow in the ways I've grown elsewhere in my life. But I just wanted to mention that I definitely feel like that played a role, because I've always felt very connected to God and Jesus and stuff like that. So then to be sitting in a house that I don't want to say that, like claims to know so much more about God than I could ever know just myself as a kid, and that basically, I don't know. And I know like saying God only loves you if you're this way is like not what they say. They say God loves everyone and stuff like that. But the messaging comes across as you're bad, and unless you follow these rules and live within these guidelines that don't work for a lot of people, then you'll burn in hell forever. I was terrified of hell. I was terrified of hell and demons and all that stuff for a very long time. So yeah, that's just a side note. Because, and I wanted to bring that up now because it played a role in my very early years. And I don't mean to offend anyone. That is my personal experience. And like I said, I'm not judging you if you love your church and all that stuff. It's just not for me at this point in my life. I also wanted to mention that I did mention that in like high school and as a young teen, I remember starting to get like the creepy looks and stuff like that and feeling very sexualized from a young age. I also took a lot of the diet culture and all that stuff, really absorbed it into my bones that you should look a certain way and be as thin as possible and stuff like that. And so pretty early on, I started having a messed up relationship with food, which a lot of people can relate to as well. And there were definite like comments from various people in my life that made me, kind of things I maybe wasn't thinking about or concerned about. All of a sudden they're pointing it out or whatever. Like I remember my mom one time commenting on like having a little belly or something. And and making comments about like, oh, well, if I ever was laying in the tub and I couldn't see my hip bones, I would stop eating snacks until I could see it again. And like, I don't know, it just feels like looking back, it just feels like hints like it, regardless, it impacted me. Um, and so starting to, and a lot of my friends were very food obsessed already too, with restrictions and portion control and this and that. Um, so I started to really, that really seeped into me. And it was all across the board for me because some people, and that very first boyfriend I would have, started and at this point in my life, I was like very slender. Started saying I was fat and stuff, and my mom's making random comments like that. But then a bully once told me that I was anorexic, and like, so it was like, it was, again, confusion is like a theme of it, of like, just, okay, I'm too fat or I'm too thin. I'm just, whatever it is, it's wrong. My body is wrong. And so I started to hate my body, like nitpicking and wishing it was this way or that way, and just, you know, again, another kind of means of trying to control things, or not like self-medicate, but just have some sort of outlet or control. By high school, I had started getting into the gym, and really liking it, lifting weights lightly, but really heavy into cardio, of course. Um, but I started to really get comfortable in the gym setting and really enjoying it. I was the kind of person for a long time that would like really hit the gym hard and consistently for like a couple months in a row, and then stop going for a month or more and then have to start all over. So I remember that kind of cycle. um, at this point, I tried maybe a couple yoga classes with my mom. My mom was pretty into yoga. And it's so funny because at first I hated it. I hated Shavasana specifically because I would always, I was like, I don't get it. I'm just laying here. I'm either going to fall asleep and wake up and my contacts are glued to my eyes and I can't see anything for 5 minutes while everyone's trying to shuffle out the door, or I just lay there like, what the heck? And now I'm like, you couldn't be alone 2 minutes with your thoughts. Like, that's what it is. But yeah, at the time, it's fun. It's just funny because now my relationship with yoga is so different than my first experience, where I was like, nah, like, it's all right, but it's just, I'm like, I'm looking for the calorie burn and stuff. It was very, all my exercise was very like punishment oriented. Like, you ate this, so go work hard at the gym and burn it off type thing. Like, ridiculous. And so yoga for me was not enough of a calorie burn. And into college is when I started getting more interested in weights, less interested in cardio, but really still struggling with food. When I went to college, there were some, kind of like I say, I experimented with like drugs and alcohol. I like experimented with like disordered eating habits too, to see kind of like if that was a way that I could get the perfect body that I was like striving for. And pretty early on, I realized that I'm never going to I'm never going to be happy with my body, because I can't even acknowledge like, this person has a perfect body. Like, I've never seen the perfect body. So if I've never even seen an example of it, I was like, okay, I don't think this is a real thing. But at the same time, I'm like, I'm still going to go for it, like, and starve myself and all this stuff. So really, just not treating my body the way it deserved to be treated, obviously, and all of this. And really starting to hate it, to grow to hate it. For I think I resented that it somehow was this like the female body is like this object of desire, and yet we hate it. We hate everything about it. And I feel that way about men and women. We love, to look at them, but then we also love to tear them apart, and use and abuse women. So again, confusing that you're it's just a solid object, and what we hate is that there's a person attached. I think is really what it was. And it's like, well, I'm screwed then because I'm in here. I'm in here. So yeah, just I wanted to mention the whole, because I want to make it very clear that yoga has been there from very early on, but it didn't start as like this magic. I walked into a yoga studio and all my problems were cured. That wasn't my experience, and it's most likely not going to be yours. Like, that's just the cold hard truth. So yeah, I wanted to mention a little bit more about my specific relationship with food and with my body. Um, let's see. And so where I left off last time, that was a very long 17-minute recap and touching on other points. But where I left off last time is when my mom marched in the door and confronted me with what was at the time my world's biggest, deepest, darkest secret, that I had essentially vowed to never talk to anyone about ever again. And I acknowledged it. I said yes. And then I remember, was sobbing hysterically. And she very much was like, oh my God, my babies, my babies. And that was the only time that I felt like she was genuinely sad for us and heartbroken, like for me and my sister. She did pretty quickly say, well, usually when people do that, they were victimized too. So someone must have done that to him. So all three of my babies, I remember that. And I was so overwhelmed at the time that I literally was like, my boyfriend's coming to pick me up. Like, I'm leaving. Like, and I felt immense guilt that my mom was like sobbing, crying. I hated it. I would have done, honest to God, I didn't feel bad for myself at that point. I felt so bad for what it must feel like to be a mother and have, your children tell you that this was their experience. I couldn't even fathom what she was going through, and how heartbroken she must be. And even to learn that your other child, did that, that's a heartbreak in and of itself. So I felt so much guilt that she knew now, and she was just so heartbroken. And so I ended up leaving, and I remember her, like, she didn't really want me to leave, which is understandable. She was kind of like, you're leaving? And I was like, I'm out of here. And she said, please don't tell him. Please don't tell anyone. And I kind of was like, at the time, I was kind of like, at the same time as I was like taken back by it, I also was like, of course, I'm not going to fucking tell anyone. I haven't told anyone this in my entire life. Like, no, I'm not going to tell anyone. And I don't know at one point, but I did specifically request that we don't tell the grandparents, her mom and dad, who we were very close with. I remember saying, like, I just don't want anyone to know. And I think it was challenging for my sister. Again, I won't speak for her, but her and I, it's funny, we go in cycles where one of us is like, this is wrong, let's get justice, and the other one's like, let's just keep the peace. Like, we don't need to do this. And then, you know, that person that's like, rah, this is Sparta, gets knocked down, and the other person gets like fired up. And the first person is like, I don't want to fight anymore. And it's like, get your ass up. We're fighting. That has been well, until fairly recently in our life, that has been one of us is ready to fight our asses off, and the other's like, nah, let's not. Like, I need a break. So at that point, she was very much this is wrong. Let's fix it. Like, I'm not doing this anymore. And I was kind of like, okay, like, everyone just stop yelling, like, stop crying, stop yelling. And so, yeah, she very quickly was like, don't tell anyone. I was like, yes, please don't, because I felt so much shame and guilt and disgust. I was like, no, I don't want anyone to know that this happened to me. And I felt it was me. I wasn't worried about him. I was worried about how gross I am, which again, now it's like, oh, you poor little baby. Like, I wish I could just go back and kiss you and hug you and tell you it's not you. You're not gross. You're not dirty. You're not shameful. But yeah, that is how I felt. And I'm pretty sure I did tell my boyfriend at the time what had happened, but that was it. I didn't tell anyone else. And my mom was, she must have been heartbroken. She is very good at making herself a victim, even if she's not a victim, and making it all about her victim experience. So, like, my sister and I at the time were obviously the victims. She was a victim of like the situation, but she made it solely about her victim experience. And I would come home from school and she'd be sobbing in the bathroom. And it got to the point that I was like genuinely concerned about her, like and this was my very first, I think the very first time I thought to myself, something's not quite right with her. Because, and I should say, my mom was like my best friend. We did have explosive fights in high school, but we were pretty close, decently close. I did start rebelling, but especially, I mean, I guess I'm kind of jumping around here, especially in my early college years. Like, I would have said she's my best friend. She and I were very, very close. I was always a mama's girl. And so the first time I realized like something's not quite right with her, actually, I mean, I knew she was kind of like, she was a screamer. She would scream about everything, and often make a point to do it when I had friends over or something like that. So we knew that. But the first time I thought a little bit deeper about it was one of these times that I came home and I couldn't find her. I don't know, my sister must have had something after school. And I couldn't find her for a minute. And it flashed in my head like, oh my gosh, I think, what if I find her body right now? And when I found her, and I happened upon her, she wasn't hiding. Nothing was wrong. She was like in the bathroom or something. And I said, I think she was crying, and I like gave her a hug and stuff. And I said, I was worried that you killed yourself or something. And instead of easing my fears, she said, I've been thinking about it. And I was kind of like, I don't even know how I responded to that. But I remember at some point shortly after, maybe walking away, like, she would never do that because she's too narcissistic. Like, she would never let someone find her body like that. That was just my thought. Like, and I was kind of like, that's probably not normal. So yeah, and at the time I definitely did not hold that against her, but now knowing what I know about like they call it emotional incest, where you are like the it's just emotionally inappropriate to put those kind of that pressure and those worries on your child, like you are the parent. So now that specific incident really pisses me off when I think about it. At the time, I was just so concerned for my mom and felt so bad, and I didn't think that she would actually do something like that. um, but I did think that she was truly just heartbroken and destroyed over this. um, and so that was several weeks of just her being a hysterical mess and really feeling like my feelings were not important and that I just needed to help her through it. And kind of like wish that I could put it back in the box. Um, there was a time, I want to say it was some sort of fight that my mom and I had, or maybe my sister and and I was supposed to go to work, and I was like, "Fuck it, I'm not going." Like I'm not going, and my mom was mad about that, obviously, and the fight, went on. And I just walked out the door, and my boyfriend at the time lived like maybe 2 miles away, so I was walking towards his house, and my mom got in the car and followed me and pulled up alongside of me and was trying to talk to me about getting in the car and all this stuff, and I just kept walking, and she would like move the car, follow me, get out, and try and get me to get in, and I wouldn't. She'd kind of like grab me and like try and put me in the back seat, and I would like slide through and open the door and then keep walking. And it got to the point I mentioned in my blog, like of her ripping out chunks of my hair, because it got to the point that she was like trying to physically like grab my body and pull me in. And at one point she grabbed me by the hair, which like really hurts. If you've never had that happen, it really, really hurts. And I remember like grabbing hers back. And I think maybe that was at the point where she put me in the back seat, and I just kind of climbed through, and I was very, I mean, my body was responding as if I was being attacked, because I was very aggravated and upset and fighting back tears and just trying to keep, walking to his house. And eventually um she left me alone, and I walked all the way to my boyfriend's house. um and that's just one example. Like these fights would, for whatever reason, because as much as I was trying to like keep the peace, I also, there were some times that I wouldn't take it. um I can't even think of like an example of why the fight would start. um and it started uh pretty quickly after that. I mean, and I'm not saying, I mean, maybe a couple months, it started getting to the point where she was not going to accept having two separate, sets of kids, basically. Um, and he was away at college at this point. He went to college like 30 minutes away. So he was nearby, but he lived there. So it really wasn't that uh like we didn't see him that much anymore. He would come home occasionally after this. So after it came out, he didn't come home for a bit. But it started she started to make it clear that it was not going to happen, that we were kept separate. I never once gave my mom an ultimatum that it's me or him. Like, you can never talk to him again. Never. I just didn't want to be around him. And which I think is totally acceptable. But yeah, pretty quickly I came home from school and she like met me in the hallway and said something about, I took your brother to be evaluated and they came to the conclusion that nothing is wrong with him. He's just curious. And at the time, it pissed me off. I shut it down. I was like, I don't want to hear that. Don't talk to me about that. Don't tell me that, blah, blah, blah. And she was like, okay, okay, okay. And that was that. Fast forward years later in counseling for my like first time that I'm kind of like telling my story, and I get to that part, and my counselor is like, how would they have possibly come to that conclusion if they never interviewed the witnesses? And mind you, my sister and I were well under 18 at that time. We were minors. We were sexually abused. If they would have fully divulged that, that is a mandatory report situation, and we would have had to be interviewed. There would have had to be some sort of intervention. There is no way in hell that they could have come to the conclusion that nothing is wrong with him. He was just curious, if they hadn't even talked to the victims. And I'll say this, it's common. Well, maybe I shouldn't put it that way because I'm not an expert. But in our experience, my sister, when she shared, this is what happened. She shared this much, this many details. But really, that is like the tippiest tip of the iceberg of what actually went down. And that's not, from what I understand, that is not unusual when a victim first comes forward. So in my mom's head, I think, she took that as, this is all that ever happened, and anything else you say is a lie because that is not what you initially told me. So yeah, she tried to say, and I'm jumping back now. I learned that much later on. Jumping back now, I didn't know that is not possible, but I was still pissed about it because I was like, you can't tell me that psychopath is, nothing's wrong with him and he was just curious. Like, it's not normal to sexually abuse your siblings. That's not normal. It'll never be normal. You're never going to convince me otherwise. And I think shortly after that is when she started to invite him back to the house. And it was very much a situation of, your brother's coming home, deal with it. If you are not comfortable, find a place to sleep. So we would sleep over at a friend's house or something like that. And I won't tell Jordan's story, but she has a story about like this. She flipped shit. I think it was the first time that he was invited back, and my mom would frequently lie and say like, he's just coming for a couple hours, just stay in your room. And he was going to stay the night, and my sister flipped shit and like took off. And that was regular from what I remember. He was invited back a lot, often, and we've found places to stay. And my sister really was still fighting, like, this is not right. And I was just kind of like, okay, I'll find somewhere else to stay. I won't be around. Every holiday we were with him. We would always travel to my grandparents. So we were, in the same car, in the same house, through holidays, until I got to the point where I had jobs, and I started to say, I can't get off work. I have to work. So I did, so that I didn't have to go and be around him, because being around him was extremely uncomfortable, because he was an unsafe person, and our bodies would literally react as if we were being victimized when we had to be around the person that was victimizing us, or had victimized us. So it was terrible. It was a terrible time. It was very anxiety inducing. And that's how we spent our holidays for several years. Um, and it sucked. It really sucked. And like I said, we didn't have to see him like daily, but it was enough that it was bothersome. I was able to find some peace, I guess. Um, but around this time, my body really started to rebel against me, I think. I, in late in high school and into college, I would just get frequent UTIs, like repeatedly. Go to the doctor, get an antibiotic, have some relief for, a week or so, get another. Like ridiculous amount. And I wasn't doing, I was doing all the things they said to, do to help prevent and all that stuff, and nothing was working. And I thought that like this is going to be my life, just all the time I get these. And it lasted for several years. And now it's been years and years since I've had one, since I started speaking up and telling my story. And it's my belief, I don't have any proof, but it is my belief that my body was like, we are not going to ignore this anymore. I'm going to make it so you have to deal with this. And I know that's, I mean, a UTI, frequent UTIs, it was miserable, but it's no, there are a lot of really terrible chronic diseases that people deal with. But, and it could have been much worse, but it did. The parallel between not talking and talking, correlation with the frequency of UTIs, has been spot on. So that's just my belief and my experience. And yeah, so in college, I really started struggling with anxiety and not knowing how to deal with it, or what was wrong, kind of. Still, it kind of self-medicating with alcohol, trying to gain some control through my eating habits, um, into working out, and definitely recognize some therapeutic like benefits just from exercise. Um, um, yeah, and my at this point, like through those later years of high school and into college, like talking about how anxious I was and how deeply I was struggling, that was when my mom did set Jordan up with a therapist, and I flat out refused, because I remember saying, I can't even talk to you. I can't even talk to my friends. How am I supposed to talk to a therapist? And it was just a never gonna happen type mindset and type of situation for me. It was not for me. I was still very much not in a place that I was ready to face this at all. And I like my mom, I'm pretty sure, had my brother like write uh, letters to us, like apology letters, I guess. I know my sister read it, but I never read it. I threw it immediately away. Um, and I just wanted to keep the peace with her. I didn't want to steal the pot, stir the pot. I didn't want to make my mom cry. I just wanted this to go back in the box and go along pretending that everything was fine. And my mom really, she ran wild with the victim, her place as a victim in this story. And my mom and dad, I was saying, my mom started running a little bit wild with the her victim story, and kind of continuing to um, put me in positions that I wasn't, um, I shouldn't have had to be in as the, child and the true victim of the situation. Um, her and my dad started having trouble. Like, obviously, that's going to be a stressful time for a relationship. And specifically, one time she went out of town to her parents' house, my grandparents, without any of us, and was telling me that she like called me or texted me one day, and she was like, "I got so drunk last night, I threw up." And I was like, "Oh, like I don't I don't know what I said, but." And she was like, "Yeah, I might do it again tonight," or something like that. Like, she just wanted me to know that she was struggling, I guess. And it was just inappropriate, because I feel like naturally I'm very caring. I put myself into the caretaking role, and my mom 100% exploited that. Uh, and yeah, and so that this same trip, she like opened her own bank account and was telling me like to get the mail to make sure that my dad didn't see like her new bank account mail coming through and stuff, just like really inappropriate stuff for a teenager to be dealing with her parents. Um, and yeah, they really struggled for a while. Um, my mom basically blamed, like flat out blamed my sister for ripping her family apart, and lots of fights, lots of like chaos and turbulence in that period of my life. And I went off to college, and I feel like it was a little bit better for me than it was for Jordan, who was still in the house. But um, for me, I was just doing the college thing, trying to figure out life a little bit, dealing with, you know, anxiety, and now these like UTIs that kept popping up. But besides that, I was still kind of just like, can we just stop like fighting about this constantly, and like, talking about it all the time and stuff like that. Um, I often I still felt pretty messed up inside, but not quite as bad. Something that a frequent feeling that I dealt with through high school, the later years of high school, and into college, was constantly feeling homesick. I felt so homesick, but I'd literally be sitting at home, and it was a very like that was a hard feeling for me, because if you feel desperate for home, but you are at your home, what's that mean for what home really is? And I can say now I haven't had that feeling in so long, because, and that is just such a blessing all by itself, because that was one of the like saddest feelings in the whole world for me was thinking to myself, like, I just want to go home. I just want to go home. And then taking a second, like, I am home. So, um, yeah, it was pretty shit. um, and I do feel like she definitely kind of uh pitted my sister and I against each other. Like we were not as close as we are today. If you knew us now, I feel like in terms of importance to us, to like she's on the same level as I place my importance, basically, is what, like, she is like another half of me, kind of. We are definitely, and I don't mean that in like a, I don't know, we are our own people, but like she is that important to me. Um, so later on, in my college years, early college years, I was getting pretty, I want to say, it reminds me of learned helplessness. If you ever learned about that in like psychology or anything like that, that I got to this place where it felt so desperate and so helpless that there's nothing to be done about it. This is how it'll always be. I really, I would think about like sexual assault and rape and stuff and how common it is. And I would have these like internal debates with myself about like, is this just a part of nature? Like animals sometimes rape their, each other. And like, is it just a natural part of life? Because kind of along with like the messaging that I received as like my place as a woman, I also received messaging a lot that like basically men were animals and can't really control themselves and stuff, and they have these urges that they just can't, you know, get control of. So I wondered, is this just a part of nature that, we make a big deal out of, but it's not really that big of a deal because it's just a natural thing. And I remember expressing that to my mom. One time we were going on a road trip, her and I, to go look for, she needed a dress for some occasion. And we were shopping and it was fun, but we were having this like heart to heart on the drive. And I remember expressing that, I had been thinking and wondering that. I got that part out, and she started like kind of nodding in agreement that yes, it is a part of life. And I all of a sudden I switched. I didn't mean to, like, it wasn't a bait and switch on purpose, but looking back, that's how she took it. Because I said this of like, I've been wondering lately if it's, a part of life. And then I said, I realized though that can't be the case, because if it was natural and a part of life, the survivors and the victims wouldn't have such intense reactions and experiences afterwards. Like that just doesn't make sense. Um, and she kind of, I could just feel it, that I think of it as like, oh, she almost got me. She almost had me believing that this was just normal. Because I should also say, she took many, many opportunities to tell me things like, this happened, I was abused by a family member and I just forgave him and got over it. She told me, oh yeah, this person, insert person, a family that we were all friends with in high school, that, oh, this cousin abused this person and blah, blah, blah. And that's why this, and this. So, and there were like other instances where she really tried to make this seem like it was normal. And it feels like, when I reflect, it really feels like she was trying to like brainwash me into just believing this. And when I came out and said, I've been wondering if this is just a part of the way the world is, she's nodding her head and thinking to herself, like, I got her. I got her. And then I was like, but then I realized that's not possible. And yeah, so she really was like, and she would say things. I started to say, I felt like she was pitting my sister and I against each other. At the time, we were not nearly as close as we are now. And she would say things like, well, I can talk to you about your brother but I can't talk to Jordan about her because she just won't have any of it. She's just so unreasonable, and like, stuff like that. And I don't know, it almost worked, I feel like. When I was a sophomore in college and we transferred, and my sister was a freshman, and we were both at Edinburgh, we started to get a lot closer. My sister and I still had like normal sister fights, but we started to get significantly closer. And I think my mom really resented that. She didn't like that. And so she would do things to purposefully drive a wedge. Can't stop playing with this ring and it keeps going flying. She would do things to purposefully drive a wedge between us. And this was around the time that I met AJ, who is now my husband, if you don't know. And I was, well, okay, so let me rewind a bit. I have here my first introduction to meditation was when I was a freshman in college. In the dorms, they had like someone come in and they had like a little, I don't even know what you would call it, like meeting in one of the lounges, where this guy taught us like progressive relaxation. And that's the first place I ever learned about 478 breathing, which, like, if you know me, that is my jam. Like, that is my strongest tool. So the very first time that was introduced to me, and like meditation in general, was in college. And it helped me immensely, because at that point in my life, it started in high school, that I had to start, I didn't have to, but I started obsessively watching the same show or movie over and over, and I had to do it to sleep. I could not sleep with nothing, because my brain it wouldn't shut the fuck up. I would just go, I'd be in a whole nother world, and it would take me hours to fall asleep. And I discovered that if I put on a familiar movie, I would watch and pay attention until I was too tired, and I would like eventually fall asleep. So it occupied my mind. And that served me for, honestly, until about a year ago. Not even a year ago, I was still doing that. I had my comfort shows that I would put on to sleep, because sleep was difficult for me, because not only do I feel like anxieties kind of tend to intensify at night, but like I was abused through the nights. So sleep was very difficult for me. And I am the kind of person that I need my sleep. So I use this survival mechanism of this familiar show over and over again. That's how I fall asleep. Um, so yeah, that was my first introduction to meditation, and that was earlier on in the timeline. So I wanted to kind of rewind before I go um, forward. And back to, so fast forward just a little bit, but of this time where I'm still, I think that I'm super close with my mom. I think she's my best friend. My mom was the kind of person that would constantly talk about how much she gave up for us, and that the moment that she found out she was pregnant with my older brother, her life was no longer about her, it was all about us. And just how deeply she loved us and all that stuff, it was like constant her saying that. And I believed it. I really believed it. It wasn't until it's like that, when you're in an abusive cycle, and my mom was emotionally abusive. I am not like making any quips about that. She was. When you are in that emotionally abusive cycle, you don't you don't know it. You do not know it. And you might have like feelings of this is wrong or this is messed up, but once you start to break out of that cycle, you start to notice more and more how messed up everything was. And she would just constantly talk about how much she loved us, how much she sacrificed for us and all that stuff. But none of her actions supported those words. um, and I'll talk about it a little bit later on when I actually did break free from my mom, the feelings of like mourning someone who didn't even exist. Um, but so yeah, fast forward to I met AJ, and it took us a while. We are stubborn and stuff. We had our own relationship issues going into my relationship with him. But when we like really started dating and stuff, it became pretty obvious that he was the person that I was going to spend my life with. um to me, and I think it was apparent to everyone else too. I mean, my sister and my mom. um Around this time, I started just bouncing back to like the fitness and like yoga. This is when, if you've known me since this period, this is when I started training for a fitness competition, a bikini competition. And I did that for like 4 months. At this point, I was into lifting, like lifting. I wasn't afraid to go lift heavy. I got over that, like, don't want to sweat and scared of getting bulky phase. And I was into it. Still had a very unhealthy relationship with food. And at this point, I mentioned how I tried on a bunch of like disordered eating habits. At this point, I would say it's the whatever the disorder is where you are like obsessed with eating healthy. That is the point that I was at, that I it's like food is fuel, and like I only want to eat things that are healthy. And the fitness competition training for that, I went on this super strict meal plan of like baked chicken. I'm a vegetarian now for like 3 years. So it's just, oh, I can't, all the chicken, so gross. Sweet potatoes, oatmeal. And that was like it. And I was eating, I wasn't starving myself, but it was only those things. And it fucked with my relationship with food way more because I was so deprived. I was restricting myself from all the foods that I enjoyed for so long. I mean, it was 4 months, but it felt so long. I had this massive list in my phone of all the food I wanted to eat when I was done. And when that competition was over, it didn't actually like work out. They canceled the competition at the last minute, which was like heartbreaking for me too, having trained so hard for it. But after that happened, I was like, I wanted to eat every food on my list all at once. Like I felt so deprived for so long. And I didn't really realize how much that affected me um, and my relationship with food for a long time. But I honestly feel like I still am dealing with it, because if I ever um, start to feel like I uh, am being restricted, like subconsciously I rebel. I will not, I'm like, I will never be restricted ever, ever again. Um, so that, and that during that period in like my fitness life, I started regularly going to yoga, still mostly as another way to like get a workout in and like stretch, because I was working out and lifting so much that I needed like something to help me not be in pain, basically, not be constantly sore. And at that point, I started to genuinely like yoga. I still didn't get Shavasana. I still hated it because I'd like I said, either fall asleep and my contacts would be glued to my eyes when I woke up, or I'd just lay there like trying not to sleep. Like, when is this over? When can I get up? And I never understood. I hated how much emphasis was placed on breath and like movement with breath. That was a real turnoff for me for yoga. I was like, what the fuck does that mean? How do you move with you breathe when you breathe? Because I'm breathing like this. How can I possibly move that fast? So I didn't really get it, but I was doing it regularly. And when this whole fitness uh, competition fell through, I feel like I kind of was like, well, fuck the diet and fuck working out. Um, so because I still felt like you work out to punish yourself for what you ate, basically, or you work out to burn off what you ate. And so naturally, sometimes when you feel like all your hard work was for nothing, you're going to rebel against those kind of thoughts. And so I stopped working out for a while. I gained a ton of weight. And was really, really uncomfortable and unhappy with that, and struggled a lot with my body image at that point, because I went from being the absolute leanest I've ever been. Like, I'm not the kind of person that would naturally have abs. Like, I just always have a little fluff on my belly. That's always, even when I was like very thin in high school, that's just kind of how my body is genetically. And I desperately wanted abs because they're such a mark of discipline in my head. And during this phase where I was trying to compete, I was very, very lean. I had like 6-pack abs, and I was very proud of them. I went from that to being heavier than I've ever been, like very quickly, because of my refusal to like move my body, kind of like this rebellion of like, no, I'm not doing it. And like just absolutely gorging myself on the foods that I had felt like I'd been deprived of for so long. So that was hard on my self-image. I just felt totally worthless. Like a lot of women I'm sure can relate that if you don't feel attractive, you feel like you're worthless, and it's horrible. It's sad, but that's how I felt. Um, and um, yeah, so just during this period, I was still really, really close with my mom. My mom started, I think everyone around me started to realize, like, oh, she's now with the guy that she's going to marry. Um, we would still have explosive fights. She'd sometimes like lock me out of the house and, stuff like that. And by the time uh, I met AJ and was like serious with him, there started to be some cracks, real cracks forming in our relationship. She started to push me a little bit too far. I started to see the manipulation, and her putting herself and her needs above mine and my sister's. And that time in the car when I felt like she almost brainwashed me into believing what she wanted me to believe was kind of my first tiny crack that I recognized. Another one was, I think it was before AJ and I got engaged, but it was close. I wanted it. I wanted to be engaged. And I knew he was like getting serious about it too. And my sister and my mom and I were at this coffee house, this lovely little coffee house, having drinks and chatting, having heart to hearts, talking about all sorts of stuff. And, you know, somehow our future weddings came up, and I, for whatever reason, was in this place that I expressed to her that I would never want my brother in my wedding. Like, he would never be in my wedding party. And my mom was like, well, that's okay. That's okay. He doesn't have to be that. Like, that's not always, siblings are not always in the bridal party, but I think it would kill me if he wasn't invited to the wedding. And, I never wanted to hurt my mom. So that it's like, okay, it is not an option for him to not be at the wedding. So I kind of knew that going into it. I wouldn't have to, have him standing up there with me, but he would be at my wedding. Um, when we did get engaged, AJ and I, that was the absolute beginning of the end for my relationship with my mom. Because wedding planning was kind of a nightmare to begin with, because I wanted, like, and she had even said that her mom kind of took over her wedding plans, and she didn't want to do that, but that's what she did. She took over mine to plan the wedding that she wanted, that her mom, you see the cycle. um but I really just wanted to get married in a park underneath a huge beautiful tree with like lights wrapped around it. That is all I wanted. I'm like a very big tree hugger. There's something about like giant old trees I just love, and I wanted that. I wanted to get married beneath a tree with wrapped in like fairy lights. And it was going to happen, and then the dress that I picked, and my mom said something about dragging that dress through the mud, and she never said you can't do it, you have to do it somewhere else, but it kind of was a battle I wasn't willing to fight. I was just like, okay, we'll change it. We'll go somewhere else. So like, it wasn't terrible. She did kind of take control of that. And I remember at my bridal shower, um, my bridesmaids had organized like a game or a quiz that was who knows the bride best. And it was all these questions that, like, they were questions that you wouldn't have to spend a ton of time with me to know the answers. Like, for example, at that time in my life, my favorite show was Family Guy. I would quote it all the time. It's fucking hilarious. That is the show that I would put on to fall asleep to. And like the question was like, what's her favorite TV show? So every single person knows Family Guy unless they don't know me. And I noticed when they went through and like quizzed everyone and like raise your hand if you got it right. My mom didn't get like a single question right. She answered, in fact, she answered most of her questions for answers for herself. And later on, I can see my mom saw me only as a projection of herself or an extension of herself. She didn't see me as an individual. So she didn't really know who I was, and she didn't care to know who I was. And I remember being, I wasn't shocked in like like, what the hell, mom? I just took it in like, oh, my mom doesn't know me. Also, at that bridal shower, she was standing there bragging to other people. I don't even know who, I can't even think of who they were, about who my brother is and what he's doing with his life. And he's going to be a lawyer and he's so smart and stuff like this. This was common because he's following this prestigious path that she is acceptable to her and honorable to her. So she always found a way to bring that up and like brag about him and how successful he is. And it really started to eat at me, that she would just talk about him nonstop and how proud she was of him, knowing what he did to me and my sister, and just going on and on about him. And so it started to eat at me. I started to see that she doesn't even really know who I am. I started to notice her manipulation tactics, and that she was kind of turning herself into the victim. There had been some asks of Jordan and I to simply forgive and forget and move on. She used to say all the time, you need to forgive him. You need to forgive him. She even like wrote us to just notice that this wasn't the relationship that I really thought that it was. And so wedding planning kind of sucked, but wasn't absolutely terrible. That is until my rehearsal dinner. And this was like a week before. And I told my mom, like, listen, we invited him to the wedding, but the rehearsal dinner was going to be at her house, which was small, and like just the bridal party and parents. And so I was like, I do not want him there. And that shouldn't have been such a big deal, right? Like, it's the rehearsal dinner we were literally having. We went to, the place, ran through it, went back to her house and had pizza and a couple drinks, and that was it. It was a big deal. She threw the mother of all tantrums and said that if he wasn't coming, she wasn't coming. And that normally would have been something I probably would have been like, okay, mom, like, I'm not going to fight with you. But again, kind of like with my very first boyfriend, something in me switched and I was like, no, like, too far. It was like, you pushed me way too far. The straw that broke the camel's back. That was the very last thing. And I said, okay, cancel the wedding. And she backed down, and ended up like it was, I don't know, she made sure I knew she was so upset, but she was there and everything, went to plan, I guess. Um, Another fight, at this point, it was really progressing. I was getting, my patience was growing thinner and thinner, and my like empathy and sympathy for her. Um, I think at that point, I realized to the extent it was at my cost. It was taking care of her at the expense of my own well-being. And one of our many fights, um, there were a lot. I said to her, I just flat out said, like, Mom, it feels like you blame Jordan and I for ruining the family. And that's another example, an instance where a mom should say, honey, no, and reassure me. She didn't say anything. And in fact, that fight, however it ended, it was like 3 days of her giving me the silent treatment before she came back. And it was later I found out through Jordan that it was because of my dad that she actually came back and said, oh, that's not what I meant, and no, of course I don't blame you and stuff. um yeah, it took her like 3 days of the silent treatment before she finally was like, no, I don't blame you. But like, it was very apparent that she blamed Jordan and I for her family falling apart because we wouldn't just forgive and move on. And I have a lot to say about forgiveness, too. Um, and so, yeah, that, I guess I'm going to leave it there because this is already probably way too long, for part two. So next time I'll talk about the wedding itself and how that was kind of, um, in my head. What's the word? I don't want to say like traumatic, but and I don't want to say it sucked because like it was my wedding. I'm marrying AJ was the best thing that's ever happened to me, besides having my boys. But I wish I could redo the wedding. So I'll tell you about that next time.